So, a little break from the lessons, and I'm going to talk about me. Me, 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 me. I started playing guitar at 6-year-old. I found a plastic guitar under my brother's bed with 2 strings on it. I picked it up, and before long I was able to play Michelle by the Beatles. So we're going back to around about 1966 or 1967 at this point. It's quite a complicated melody actually, and I'm kind of amazed it was the first thing I learnt to play, but I became obsessed with the instrument at a very young age. I literally used to go to bed with the guitar in my hand, and you couldn't prise it out of me. As soon as I came back from school, I would pick up the guitar. I became a bit of a bookworm. I bought loads of books, and I listened to all the current music I could get my hands on. From a very early age I got into Led Zeppelin. I listened to the rock music of the time. At around about the age of 13 or so, or maybe 14, I got into the Mahavishnu Orchestra. I found Joe Pass, and we had record players back then, and I used to put my finger on the record and slow the record down to half speed so that I could hear the phrases more clearly. And I'd hear one phrase, I'd pick it out, I'd memorise it in my head, and I'd learn it on guitar. And this is generally how I learned guitar as a youngster. This obsession went on. I continued learning and learning and learning. And then when I was around about 15 or 16, I discovered a guitar player called Aldi Meola. And then slightly after that, an album was released by a band he played in called Return to Forever. And the album was called Romantic Warrior. He took a guitar solo on the title track, Romantic Warrior, and he took it on acoustic guitar. It changed my life forever because I'd never heard such sublimely beautiful guitar in my life. It superseded fast. It didn't even sound fast. It sounded like a river of musical notes cascading. It was entirely beautiful to my ear, and I wanted to be able to do that. It didn't sound like showing off. It just sounded like a beautiful musical expression. And luckily, that year, I had the privilege of being able to see Return to Forever live in concert. In fact, I had a front row ticket, by chance, right in front of Al. And I can tell you, I was the guy on that gig with the laser eyes. I was like this, watching his hand, every move. I don't know if I even blinked through the gig. And I saw that he held his hand completely differently to mine. Like I was talking about before, this closed hand technique. I was actually playing with my hand hanging out at the time. I ran home, I closed my hand, and I adopted exactly what I'd been analysing that night, and I stuck with that from then on. I also bought his book, and I became obsessed with being able to play that style. Consequently, he released a series of solo records, mind-blowing solo records, and also went on to play with the Guitar Trio, with John McLaughlin, who is another phenomenal alternate picker, and Paco de Lucia. I urge you to go and check out some of these recordings and these live videos, because the alternate picking and the playing in them is absolutely out of this world. To this day, it's still totally world-class playing. And this was my obsession when I was a kid. Well, it wasn't my only obsession, because I loved other players. Pat Metheny took over a big part of my life because of his beautiful melodic phrasing and instantaneous composition. Joe Pass's jazz style, I became completely absorbed in that as well. Jim Hall. These players are profoundly musical, so that was equally as important to me as a youngster in my development as the fast style Di Meola type of playing was. But Di Meola's playing was also very melodic and musical as well. So as I said in my first introduction to this, you know, it's just as important. In fact, it's much more important to play melodically than it is to play fast. But this was my thing as a youngster, was combining these techniques. As far as my own personal technique goes, when it comes to alternate picking, I like the sound of pan muted. The reason for that is there's more note definition. There's less sustain in the note, the notes pop more, and you can hear the phrase much more clearly when you palm mute. And there's a few different ways to do that depending on how close your palm is to the actual bridge itself. So if that's the bridge and you take your hand past the bridge, then it's open. If you lightly place it upon the bridge, you're starting to mute. If you move it slightly forward, you're muting a little bit more. And there's another technique I like quite a lot, which is when I push my hand to the other side of the bridge and push down slightly. When I do this, because of the nature of the guitar, when I play the high strings, my finger, which we've talked about extending before, this drops down. It enables me to push in a little bit harder. It's slightly more difficult, but I get a lot more pop out of the alternate picking muting technique by pushing this finger down and pushing in a little bit harder. And the note definition is phenomenal when you do that. The notes literally only last for milliseconds. So this is the kind of technique I like, but they're all great, and the slightly open muted technique is probably the most musical sounding. It's lovely sounding. So that's how I approach muting. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the instrument you practice on. I know this is going to raise a lot of eyebrows and I'm probably going to anger quite a lot of people, but I practice all the time on acoustic. I always have done. The only time I ever actually pick up an electric is either to do a gig, a rehearsal, or a recording studio. At home, I practice exclusively on acoustic, and I have done since I was a child. I think it's a lot more difficult to learn these techniques, especially difficult techniques like alternate picking. It's much more difficult on acoustic than it is electric. It gives no quarter, and when you practice this on electric with distortion, any level of distortion, then you're covering up a lot of your mistakes and you're taking away a lot of your dynamics. To be honest with you, I actually feel like anybody can do alternate pick on an electric guitar. If I pick up an electric guitar after I've been practicing on an acoustic, it feels like a little toy in my hands. It's incredibly easy to do on electric, and the distortion covers up a multitude of sins. So I absolutely recommend that you get yourself an acoustic. This is not an advertisement because I'm not endorsed by anybody, but a good cheap option would probably be something like a Yamaha APX 4, 6, 8, or if you can afford it, a 10. These guitars have bridge pegs in them. What I do is I remove the bridge pegs, I fill up the holes, and I drill holes through the bridge, almost diagonally, slightly at an angle, like Loudon guitars, like Takamine guitars, which their strings go through the bridge and attach at the back of the bridge. This means that you don't have anything to obstruct your hand. And as a matter of course, I do that to all my acoustics that I'm going to alternate pick on. So I would say that if you're going to learn this technique, do it the way I do it. Do it like a purist. Make sure you can do it on the acoustic instrument, and then when you swap over to electric, it will become incredibly easy for you. And the next thing I'd like to talk about is it's very easy to fool yourself that you're doing something that you're not really doing when you're practicing. Your ears and your hands might tell you you're doing something, but I'll tell you now, if you record yourself towards the end of every day's practice session, either audio recording or do it with your iPhone, and listen to what you're playing, you might well find that what you hear back isn't what you've been hearing in your head. So it's always really important to document your progress by doing this.
Don't forget to like,
comment, and subscribe!